Our two guests this morning, one of them is the Principal Secretary in the State Department for EAC in the Ministry of the East African Community and Regional Development, Dr. Kevit Desai. Good morning and thank you very much for joining us in the studio.
Thank you.
Good to have you. Our other guest is the man who's been here before. Well, Dr. Desai has also been here before, just not here physically. This time, first time in the studio. But Amadi, the Ebenezer, he's a program manager for Sustainable Inclusive Business at the Kenya Private Sector Alliance. Good to have you in the show, Amadi.
Good to be here, and thank you, Eric and Du and CT. I think you were trying to give me some leeway here because you've just introduced Dr. Desai, and there's no title to my name, so you added the Ebenezer.
Yes.
I think, why don't we bring about an element of equity? The Dr. Desai and the Ebenezer. How is that?
The Ebenezer is still superior. And Dr. Desai agrees. Amadi, the Ebenezer.
Yes, the stone of help.
Yes, the stone of help.
Yes.
Hey. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. We want to have a conversation on a matter that we've had a conversation before, and this is on the circular economy. This is on how to manage plastic waste. This is on how to make sure that we do not end up with a lot of the plastic wastes in our environment. We are picking up the plastic waste, but what are we doing with it? The 3 R's. We were talking about the 3 R's earlier. Amadi.
Yes.
Recycle, reuse,
refurbish. They could go up to 5 or 7. So there could be
Reduce is one of them.
reduce is one of them.
Reduce.
So you can start with refuse. So refuse basically says that it's a principle where you try to stop the usage of items that are problematic. For example, the single-use plastic.
Okay.
Then you can go to reuse. So, for example, good practices here that we're using the reusable bottles. See, you're taking up the good practice. There is refurbish. For example, if you're to use electronics. There is repurpose. If you were to take something and change its purpose from its original intended objective. And there is recover. That is actually towards the last. Recover when you're recovering energy. For example, if you know with waste you can recover energy towards the end instead of just disposing it in a landfill. Yeah. So it's
could go on and on.
Yeah.
Even repent.
So you can use the 3, you can use the 5.
Repent from your ways of thinking.
That touches on refuse.
Okay. So, Dr. Kevit Desai, in the East African community, and I mean, Kenya is a very, very active state in the East African community, but we also know that the countries in the EAC, and in fact, the last time you were telling us, you're looking at harmonization of laws in various states and seeing how then we can move forward on this. There has been a review of the various laws that govern waste management and use of the environment. Maybe you can just give us a brief of the latest work that's been done on reviewing some of these laws.
Indeed, the relevance of policy, legislation, regulation and standards is critical by way of how it informs those 7 R's that you mentioned, how we are able to mitigate and adapt to the transformation of and the protection of the vulnerability of the environment. And within this context, very directly associated to this conversation this morning is of course the East African Community Polythene Materials Bill, which is awaiting assent by the heads of state. But this is part of a broader effort by the EAC with respect to its responsiveness to climate change adaptation, and in essence addressing the issues of vulnerability as well as the reduction and building socio-economic resilience on the same, and promoting the disaster risk management within this context. Now, within the context of the EAC and why it's so critical is that indeed we find ourselves, even as a nation, as a sovereign nation of Kenya, we are interconnected through the transboundary ecosystems, for example, the shared resources that we have by way of Lake Victoria, or the many rivers that start from Kenya and then run into the East African community, the basins that we share across borders and so on. And so within the context of the East African community's work and the promise as well as the potential it has, it's that overarching ability to create policies, legislations, regulations that then have that ability to promote the coordination as well as the collaboration towards enhancing the overall state of integration and thereby addressing some of the pertinent challenges we have within our social, economic and environmental framework. Within this context, indeed, the frameworks that exist include 16 sectoral councils where there is collaboration on all aspects, whether it's healthcare, industrialization, security, environment, and so on. And why this is absolutely critical for this discussion this morning is that, indeed, the very essence of circularity, by way of its inclusiveness, its self-reliance, its resilience, is based on the fact that while the issue of plastic challenges with respect to a global trend of 300 million being dumped within the environment is of crucial importance, it requires that circularity to look at the entire value chain of how it's developed in order to adapt and mitigate against it. And for that, it requires the entire framework and fabric of social, economic and environmental sectors. Let me illustrate on one point. We're aware that we have a very strong research, education, as well as skills base within the EAC with its many universities. But that ability for the issues pertaining to plastic to be mainstreamed into education, research, in order to find the new generation of innovation and transformation to mitigate and adapt is critical. And therefore you need this sectoral council approach which interconnects and promotes that coordinated ability and that compassion for us to address this challenge. And so this illustrates, how important it is that within the context of a roof called the East African community, then, all partner states are able to not only leverage, synergize, but, be able to find ways in which they're able to come closer to their aspirations. Kenya, of course, leads these efforts with respect to plastic transformation and becomes one of those flagship initiatives within the East Africa community, finding solutions and that ability to promote the necessary transformation within the circularity of the economies.
You speak of the bill that is awaiting assent by the heads of state, the EAC Polythene Materials Bill. So if or when this becomes law, what will it mean? Will it mean that it becomes like the bigger, more encompassing and supreme law on governance of polythene within the East African community? Does it repeal the domestic laws in the various countries, or does it supersede the other domestic laws in the various countries?
Well, in essence, it promotes the standard within the context of the EAC and in recognition of the fact that we are totally interdependent as East African partner states, whether it's our value chains for business, our interdependency of manufacturing where produce is produced in one country and then processed in another, or that ability to trade ferociously throughout the East African community, which is now increasing in size with the addition of Congo, and that'll make us 275 million strong citizenry and almost 5.5 million square kilometers. Now, this is a huge size and a huge undertaking, but within the context of the revolution that we require with respect to the transformation of the circular economy, then, it requires not only the overarching policy and agreement and consensus, but most importantly, the standards. What will happen on the ground is eventually the East African community plastic and plastic waste management policy and strategy will be implemented. And this will then bring about the entire systematic approach towards creating the support for various initiatives, which include the necessary policies, legislations, regulations, standards, the requisite infrastructure, the ability to promote greater levels of coordination, the competency, the awareness creation. And all of this will not necessarily be a mandate from a policy perspective, but a key pointer with respect to all different structures and capacities to work themselves towards promoting the necessary integrated innovation on the cause of adaptation and mitigation.
How does this come into play, Ebenezer, from your point of view here? Because, I mean, we have this bill, to be assented to in a short while. A few days ago, we had the world basically in Nairobi talking about this same thing and saying, all right, by 2024, we're going to see that there will be an internationally legally binding document for all nations to say plastic pollution must come to an end. How does this then play out practically on the ground to see that this intersectoral approach that Doc has talked about a few minutes ago will actually come to play out in Kenya on the ground?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, I was listening to Dr. Desai, and I really appreciate his knowledge in the sector. And of course, I also admire him because he was also at the helm of the leadership of CAPSA at some point. So he understands the regional dynamics. So basically, as he mentioned, that this bill that is still in play and still awaiting assentment by the president, then provides guidance to the East African community. And of course, we normally say that the national law is always supreme to any other law if you are in the country, because you are, as he mentioned, a separate state to each other, but you come together to collaborate on matters environment, matters health, transportation, and all these other aspects. So it provides a guide to how the region should move. So what happens is that most countries will start, for example, if they do not have certain regulations, laws, and policy that are streamlined towards what the bill is talking about, then they will begin to do so. Kenya is quite ahead on this. We know that there's a national sustainable waste management policy and bill in Parliament. We are just waiting for it to come out. And then there is also the EPR regulations 2021, which is setting pace in terms of the private sector taking the challenge in terms of after post-consumption, they still have that responsibility of the product that they put in the market. And what came out of UNE actually with the agreement is that the countries, it's a good thing because the countries then did pass it, so they adopted it. And we'll begin to see countries aligning towards the proposal. And this was proposed by Rwanda. Yesterday we were having a delegation from Rwanda at CAPSA. They were coming to learn how Kenya is doing in terms of management of waste and adopting of innovations. For example, what companies are doing, for example, one of the companies that is one of the members of CAPSA is called Synergy. And they have a project that is in line with waste to energy. Now, so I was making a joke and saying that Kenya normally has very nice policies, and I think it's in the 80s and 70s, Singapore came to learn from us, and they're a first world country. So I was making a joke that now that they're here to learn from us, they probably will become a first world country.
Rwanda is the next first world country.
That's going to be so. But it was just a joke. But also touching on the question that you asked, before UNE, as Sustainable Inclusive Business, which is a knowledge center under the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, we did a review of laws, regulations, and policy in the East African region on single-use plastics. So we did this in collaboration with Anjawala and Kana. I know Dr. is aware of that, as well as Flip Floppy Foundation. And we saw the differences in the laws and regulations. For example, if I give an example of the ban of the plastic carrier bags. Rwanda did ban the flat carrier bags that are below 60 microns, right? While Kenya did ban flat carrier bags that are below 30 microns. Same to Tanzania. But on single-use plastic, you notice that Rwanda did ban single-use plastics. Kenya did in protected areas. But in Tanzania, it was straws. And the thin film plastics that you have on the bottle top of a drink that you have. So there is some, there's
disharmony in law.
Yeah, there's disharmony. So what that creates is that if you have porous borders, of course, I mean, we normally say in every market.
If we have porous borders, or is it because we have porous borders?
So what I was going to say,
Because we have realistic borders.
what I was going to say, coming from the wise wisdom that you've given us this morning, is that in every market there's always a madman. So what that translates is that in a society you'll always have the good and the not so good.
But let me ask this question. Talking about policies, harmonizing it, putting ink, pen to paper, that I get. Thought has gone into the details, that I get. And a lot of work has gone on. Daktari, Ebenezer, tell me. How then do you convince, or has enough effort been taken to convince the users of this plastic, or the citizens, as to the benefits? Because people are motivated by benefit. How do you communicate this benefit so that they join you? Because if they do not support the initiative, you can sign as many laws as you like. You can have many meetings where you agree as you like, but you will still have a problem. So, and not just the individuals, how do you convince the member states of the benefits that accrue? Because a lot of these things are also tied to trade. How do you get them on board by them understanding, actually, yes, they may be benefiting, but I benefit this way?
So I think that, Ebenezer and CT, indeed, this is the crux of the issue with respect to how do we promote the highest level of implementation and efficiency in implementation of policies, legislations and regulations. First and foremost, within the context of the East African community, the ownership, the collective leadership, the common purpose is established by this collective engagement of all stakeholders, civil society, private sector, in the development of strategies and policies. It then has many arteries of communication, which include the East African Legislative Assembly, which includes members of parliament. But above all, the need for communities to play a more significant role in the implementation of policies and the promotion of self-regulation becomes absolutely, critical within this context of how we implement many of these initiatives and create that overarching capacity for development. And indeed, within the context of whether it's trade or industrialization or any form of commerce and its use of plastics, the motivation for adaptation and mitigation comes from a sense of a clear perspective of the market. If the market, which is systematic, which consists of policies, legislations, regulations, standards, infrastructure, and so on, invokes that compassion towards innovation and transformation, then that inspires collectively the entire system to actually transition into mitigation and adaptation. And so, with respect, to illustrate, when an industrialist or, for example, a trader wakes up in the morning and he surrounds himself in an ecosystem that deters the use of plastics or is part and parcel of him or her trying to transition from where they are into a more climate-friendly use of material, then, that enables them to invest thoroughly, because there's a genuine demand from the market, and at the same time there's an overarching policy and legislation that intertwines their ability to effectively engage. And so this is a priority with respect to a collective leadership, a collective responsibility, and a collective ownership of all policies, legislations, and regulations. After all, we've all developed them in paper, as you said, in ink. But how do we as communities now promote that leadership in a multifaceted way? And I believe that KEPS is doing this tremendously within this context of the business environment. But This is where the hope is.
My question was perhaps a little unfair. So let me distill it further.
Uh-huh.
How do you convince the politicians to sell this idea effectively? How do you get the politicians, I'm talking about from the leadership within the East African community and to the leaders who fall in line in the political parties, etc., to the lowest common denominator. Why am I saying this? Most of these wonderful plans and policies that we have often go awry because of the politicians. I know it's a difficult question, but you in KEPSA, yes,
Think
Thank
it
you.
through,
Thank you very
and then
much
we
for the
respond to it after the break, right? We want to take a break now. It's coming up to 8:30. This is Kenya's biggest conversation, The Situation Room on SpiceFM, online, SpiceFM KE, YouTube and Facebook, and also on KTN Home. Dr. Kevit Desai, the Principal Secretary for EAC, and Ebenezer Amadi, the Program Manager at the Sustainable Inclusive Business Initiative at KEPSA, are in the studio with us. We are talking about legislation towards plastic pollution management in East Africa.
Spice.
It continues 25 minutes to 9. This is the Situation Room on Spice FM, online and on KTN Home. My name is Eric Latif. My co-hosts are CT Muga and Ndu Oko. Our guests this morning, PS for the East African Community, Dr. Kevit Desai, and Amadi Ebenezer from KEPSA. CT, repeat the question so that now Amadi can respond to it properly.
Well, I've had time to actually rephrase it.
He had
He was
prepared
ready
an
for
answer
that
for
one.
the other one.
I think I need a second dose for the paracetamol. You talked about, and when I listen to your phrase, to your tagline, you say sugar and spice and everything nice. So I
Yes.
think they also got the gist of it.
You see, the question that I'm concerned about is this. If you look at the power that the business community has, it is immense. And immense to the point where it influences policy because of the connection that policy has with politicians and politicians have with the business world. But the question I am really asking is, how do we ensure that beyond the commercial interests being looked after, which they usually are with policies, how do we get the mwananchi, as we call them, to get to the point where they join you in supporting this? So it isn't just a narrative that has been brought to you by way of policy, so you have no option but to abide by, but it's something that whose benefit you see and understand, so you support it. Now, I am asking, as KEPSA thinks about the many things they think of, what steps have they taken to ensure that this continuity of thought and process is actually guaranteed so that we get to that happy point where these things we keep talking about at a national level are things that the citizenry actually support? Because if they don't support you, even if they seem to be benign, what they're going to do is they are going to constantly contradict you. You only need to take a case in point of COVID and the mask.
Thank you very much, CT, for the question. I think now that you had time to rephrase it, I've also had some bullets to throw at you.
Please.
Anyway, just kidding. So, the ideal thing that we do is we provide thought leadership in the sector. And as you mentioned, the place where you have influence and interest is a nice space. If you draw the quadrant where you have a matrix of influence and interest, then you always notice that there are stakeholders that you must be keen on in stakeholder management. Now, within the private sector, one of the things that we do is through the public-private dialogue platform, we have conversations with the politicians and the lawmakers, because these are the conversations you have so that they're able to think and table the bills in Parliament. As well as when you're conducting research, so use evidence to influence that. But also, one of the things that we're also doing, I'm sure if you've been reading your newspapers, you've seen the project by KEPSA that's called Kenya Daima. What Kenya Daima does is reach out to various party leaders, and one of the things that we're driving is ensuring that they commit to peace. And the other aspect that we also have is have conversations on what is on their manifesto. So how better way can you have to sit on the table and have discussions with the politicians and influence what will happen in the government when the government is executing its strategies and of course, its projects. one aspect that is very key that is within the KEPSA's strategy is sustainability, right? And that comes in really well. And under KEPSA, we of course have the Kenya Plastics Pact that I mentioned last time, where the organizations come in and pledge to support the country to move towards a from linear to a circular economy. And if you talk about matters plastics, there are various ways for you to change behavior. And there's one thing that we call behavior change communication, right? So that is another aspect that we also are keen on, to be able to change the mindsets of the community. You see, with the implementation of the single-use plastic ban, what happened is that people began to change their mindset. You will notice, even though you're not in a protected area, and that ban is in protected areas, if you go to one of the shops where you like having your tea or your juice, you will notice that the straws are changing.
Yeah.
Yep.
You'll either have a stainless steel straw
Paper.
or you'll have a paper straw.
Right.
But you're not in a protected area, right? So companies are also beginning to change the way they operate and adoption of innovation. And then you'll also notice that now that we're in studio, all of you have hot drinks, but none of you has the single-use plastic cups, right?
Yep.
But if probably I go back into the archives in your pictures in 5 years ago, probably I'll see Eric with a mug or a cup from a shop. He just walked by to grab his coffee and come early to studio. So there is change that is happening, though not at the rates we would desire. To say that we have dealt with the plastics in totality, but there is some change that is going on in the sector.
Okay.
Now, if I compare to Uganda, for example, they normally sell water in small sachets that they call kavera.
Yeah.
The plastic ones.
Yes, the plastic one.
In Mombasa,
Yeah,
water is also sold in such a manner.
in such a manner.
Yes.
But now you see, if you were used to that, you will generally have some time to adjust to the new norm. Because you're used to buying water for about 5 bob, but now someone is telling you to buy the same at about 20 shillings because the packaging has increased the cost of production and therefore the price, right?
But you see, it tells us that the business community are very tuned in to the needs of the community in this sense. That quantity that you speak of is part of the Kadogo economy, okay? And it is you, the business people, who came up with it. You understood it. Not everybody wants half a kilo of sugar. They're probably happy with 5 teaspoons of sugar, and they're willing to buy that. Now, it's this sensitivity and in understanding these needs. That's what I'm actually speaking to, because you already understand it. But when a policy is implemented by way of fiat, you're told, here it is. Fine. People will comply because they fear the consequences. But I'm saying, you, by the way, fit right in. Behavior change communication means you are able to pass on a message that convinces the listener and the consumer that this change is in to their benefit. Yes, exactly.
Even as I hear that, and I hear Dr. Desai, and I hear you, because this is a thing that we can have all this documentation and policy, and it be wrapped up in policy documentation for years. But if we start to ask ourselves who are the perpetrators of this pollution, whether we're looking at communities which is made up of individuals or communities made up of businesses that operate with these plastics, they are the ones to whom the message must go. But then they also have to see a benefit of having an environment rid of plastics, rather than a fear of what will happen to them if they do not comply. And I think it has to get down to that rudimentary level whereby folks understand that, if we're littering, or if we're using or not reusing, or if we're not refurbishing, if we're not reducing, then it is to our detriment as a whole. So I'm really looking at and really interested to know what are the practical things What's the practical communication that is going down to the basic unit of man, of what is actually being done, so that it doesn't seem as if it's just meetings and policies that are taking place?
Thank you. And indeed, this indeed is the crux of the matter. But I think that we need to be quite optimistic, first and foremost, with respect to our collective efforts towards developing the necessary policies, legislations, and regulations. And this is very much in a way which promotes the highest level of goodwill towards this issue. Indeed, the issue with respect to implementation is a critical issue, and I think that where we need to draw inspiration and hope from is, if you look at an industry, for example, why did they use potable water or produce that does not have any aflatoxins in their production? Simply because the market wouldn't tolerate the pollution in water or any kind of health issue with respect to the produce. And subsequently, the entire structure abides within the regulations of policy. Even the machine manufacturer across the globe has to produce a machine that is friendly to the climate systems. And I think that indeed is what needs to be established with respect to a nexus between the producer and indeed, the commerce sector. Mm-hmm. And indeed, this is a value proposition for this transition, simply because the cost of processing inputs increases if it's polluted, if it's affected by plastics, etc., and so on. And therefore, the value proposition to the commerce sector is that, indeed, by having clean inputs and health, the disease-free inputs into the system, they spend less in order to process, and therefore, the overall profit margins and their sustainability increases. But this needs to be a collective effort where, this is a level playing field, and it requires the collective engagement of all stakeholders in order to create that ecosystem. It requires an ecosystem of inclusive development, and I don't mean just for humanity. I mean for environment, for the preservation of the earth, and so on. And that's where I believe the crux is.
I think the way you've just said it, it's important that we have policies and legislation, because then everything else responds to policy and legislation. And it also standardizes things. Then there's the other side of the spectrum, which is the consumer, not the consumer is demanding. The consumer is demanding affordability in terms of cost. Then that brings in the manufacturer. Single-use plastics came to address a need. And the need was, it's cheap, it's accessible, I'm done with the use. Okay, it was cheap. Now, when you move away from single-use plastic and now come into these other reusable plastics, you just said it yourself, it introduces the element of higher cost. Now, should there be some sort of encouragement to the industry and to the consumer so that then there is easier adoption of the ban on single-use and going into the circular economy? Should there be that? Because, like you're saying, the manufacturer is responding to market demand. If I come with the same product and I've put up the price by 5 shillings, we are starting to have a different conversation with my consumer. And then somebody else will unscrupulously go behind my back, try and evade the regulations and still reintroduce single-use plastic. And the market will be like, I'm comparing between cost and all, and I'll buy. Should there be some sort of incentives to both sides?
Yes, indeed. There has to be incentives. It promotes greater levels of fashion and transformation within the context of outcomes. The incentives start within the policy framework development, where it's no longer about creating mandates, but in promoting flexibility as well as pointing to certain areas of incentive and direction. And I think that needs to carry on all the way downstream, because ultimately it's the incentive of the market which becomes absolutely critical. Within the context of the EAC, the incentive mechanism and framework exists in order to to permeate the entire ecosystem. And it's one of the most incredible features, because the incentive, for example, of an industry now today consists of approaching a market of 275 million people. And within this context, the market's big enough for transformation to occur and for us to now take this extremely seriously as far as the value proposition towards sustainability of the entire region. And so then, this awareness creation, this involvement needs to invoke, that action by all stakeholders to promote the necessary adaptation and mitigation. And so the long and short is that the entire framework from, design, development, consensus development, all the way to the implementation structure is accessible. And therefore, what does it take now, and what does it take to be involved and to have that shared responsibility?
And to participate, or even to reward. You mentioned some companies, like you talked of Synergy. Synergy have been doing some work that they've been doing in the low-income areas like Kivera, which is what they have toilets that they produce, that they give out toilets for use. Just tell us what they do.
Really, so what Synergy does is that they have this models of toilets that they give to the communities, and ideally the need there was to reduce open defecation and the flying toilets, so that the lower income areas, sometimes they do not have the ability in terms of financing to either construct a toilet. Sometimes you take things for granted that you think that these things are always available. And to them it's to some of them it's a luxury, because now they don't have access, and when you need to access a toilet, then you need to go and pay, because there's a block that is there. You can go take a shower, I think for 5 bob, and use the washroom again for 5 shillings or 10 shillings. So what happens is that now they are trying to give them the toilets, and then they come and collect the waste, and then they're able to manufacture products out of it. So in that context, then you're ensuring that you reduce the waste that is going into the environment. So you safely collect, treat, and manage, and also then produce, get a product out of it. So that's what they do in terms of increasing access to sanitation.
Right.
Now, should such organizations get some sort of reward from the government just because you have invested in what the government has not been able to invest? And this is a sewer system, right? But you are providing this service, and at the same time, there's the value that you bring into to the environment. There's a value that you're bringing to livelihoods of people. Should they be getting some sort of incentive from government so that when we have more of such organizations?
So we were having this discussion the other day at Alliance Française with various partners. And we're talking about organizations that are called social enterprises. So social enterprises looks at 2 things. One, it looks at the impact it creates to the community, as well as looks at the profits it makes so that it's able to sustain itself. So the profit does not go back to the shareholders, but it helps them to implement some of the projects. So the question we are asking ourselves, how then do we promote more social enterprises in Kenya to be able to address some of these issues that are emerging in the country. And sometimes we're always very quick to say we need another policy, we need another bill, but to some extent, not all the time. Sometimes you just need to check what we have and what are the gaps, then just revise it. Because you also notice that within that context, you can register a non-governmental organization within the Companies Act as a company limited by guarantee. Right? You can also register an association through the Societies Act. So there are a number of channels that you can use with the available instruments that are there in our current state. But as well, then if you look at the challenges that exist, then we can propose different recommendations. For example, we're talking about incentives, and incentives can come in different ways. Does not necessarily have to say that you won't pay anything to the government, because even for government to operate, they also need resources, right? So in that context, yes, there is need to look at our aspects to encourage more of the social enterprises to create impacts to the communities that are marginalized.
The award schemes are useful, but not enough. We see that within the context of EAC, for example, we recognize those industries that do not pollute the environment, for example, the affluent treatment systems, etc., and so on, into rivers, and then ensuring that rivers are left conserved and potable as far as drinking water is concerned. But I think that these recognition systems, as well as award systems by government, is part of the element. Of course, the strategic element is that the consumer also awards and promotes that recognition, and thereby promotes that ability to entrench that policy and legislation, that overarching regulation. So within this context, I think that this requires a reflection in terms of the incentive mechanisms towards progressive policies, which originally were part and parcel of an inclusive development, be encouraged by all stakeholders. And this requires, various leadership schemes within the private sector association, but also and bold statements towards the transformation of their commerce sector towards this progressive climate development capacities. But indeed, it's the consumer too that is involved, and how they're able to emphasize, their choice.
So, Ebenezer, as we conclude the conversation this morning, you wanted to add on to something that Dr. Desai had said, and then you give your final closing remarks.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Eric. I think one of the things that you're speaking to and you're addressing is different aspects that we can contribute to creating change. And CT asked the question, what is the private sector doing to create the change? So with that aspect, there's an aspect of corporate social responsibility, where companies are also coming in to support the communities that they have. We saw during COVID that different members, for example, GM, that is just close to you here, who are giving hand washing points. We saw Bidco giving out the soap that they manufacture. We saw Coke going out also to, ensuring that people have access to sanitation. So the change that is coming then is because different players are playing their role towards streamlining it to the our objective to increase access to sanitation, water, and also deal with the plastics.
Great. Dr. Desai, as you conclude, your closing remarks.
Indeed, I think that we need to make a decision here today after this meeting and this conversation, and I think that two decisions need to be made on the aspects, first and foremost, of how we promote the adaptation and mitigation of efforts towards conservation and climate change. And that means that, that it requires us to come up with very creative ideas, collective. To illustrate further, Kenya's progress as far as tree planting is both an adaptation and mitigation effort towards climate change.
Yeah.
But we need a lot more, and these need to come from all stakeholders in view of the fact that the entire policy framework, the legislation framework, and the regulatory framework is self-involving. And so that ability to engage is a key decision here after this conversation. The second is indeed that we recognize that policies, strategies are not there to promote mandates, but are there to promote the inclusive development of flexibility and incentives, and the ability to ensure that they point to a better future. And therefore, you need to be involved in all of this.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kevit Desai is a Principal Secretary for East African Community. He's been here in the studio with us alongside Ebenezer Amadi, Program Manager for Sustainable Inclusive Business at the Kenya Private Sector Alliance. We've been talking about the legislation that's required towards plastic pollution management in the East African community, and the work and the effort that's being done at government level, at private sector level, and at consumer level towards realizing this goal.